Hello, welcome to the New York School of Design Sewing Basics course. And once again, I'm Hannah Noth and I'll be your instructor for this series. Today we're going to dive into the world of seam finishes. The first method I'm going to show you today is how to sew a French seam. Now this is a timeless technique and it's really quite foolproof. You will be sewing one extra seam in this step, but it will completely hide your raw edges. You won't even know they ever existed. It's pretty awesome. Let me show you an example of the French seam we're about to sew. This is the outside of the seam, right here. Looks pretty normal, doesn't it? Let's look at the inside now. You see here on the inside of the seam that this edge here is folded over. There's actually another seam in here. So no raw edges on the outside, and it just lays nice and flat. It can be ironed to one side. So that's what a French seam looks like. If you were to turn an item that has a French seam on the inside out, you wouldn't find any raw edges. And it's extremely simple to sew a French seam. Okay, let's learn how to sew a French seam. I'm going to use a printed fabric for this because it's really important in the case of a French seam to differentiate between the right side of the fabric and the wrong side of the fabric. And it's really clear to see in this fabric. So that's why I'm using this. Before you sew a French seam, you have to do a little bit of math because your French seam will be composed of two seams, and you want the seam allowance of those two seams to equal the total seam allowance that you're sewing your garment with. So for example, say that you are sewing a dress with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. In order to sew a French seam, you're going to be sewing one narrow seam and then one wider seam. And you need those seam allowances to then equal 5/8 of an inch. So in the case of this specific French seam, I think I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance for my first seam and then a 3/8 inch seam allowance for the second and final seam. And that way, that will total 5/8 inch seam allowance. So that's how I'm going to start. Similar to the flat felled seam, you are going to once again start sewing with your fabrics wrong sides together, right sides facing out. I know, it's different than what you normally sew, but that's what we're going to start with French seams. So I'm going to line up my raw edges and place a couple pins in them perpendicular to the edge to make sure that they stay in place. I'm going to trim a little bit off this edge of fabric so it's nice and straight. Okay. Now remember, my first seam allowance in a French seam is always going to be smaller than the seam allowance of the second seam. You'll see why in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and sew this 1/4 inch seam allowance, which lines up with the edge of my presser foot. I'm going to clip my threads. And there's the first seam of my French seam. I'm halfway there. This is the one with the 1/4 inch narrow seam allowance. Now I'm going to turn my fabric over. And you can use an iron here to make sure that your seam lies nice and crisp and flat against the seam that you just sewed. I'm going to use a couple pins to help me ensure that it lies flat there. Okay, so I have those pins in place. Once you've pinned or ironed this seam here, ready to sew it, go ahead and sew it with that second seam allowance that you decided on. Remember, it has to be greater than this seam allowance that you just sewed the first French seam on. So I'm going to sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I line it up on my machine, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew down. Alright, cut my threads. And let's look at our French seam from the inside and then from the outside of the garment. So see here on the right side of your fabric, it looks like a normal seam. But if you go to the inside of your garment, you can see that there's now no more raw fabric on the inside of the seam. You can iron your French seam to the side so it will create less bulk. Even with that though, you'll see that because of this additional seam on the inside of your French seam, there's no need to worry about loose threads or raw edges. So there you have it. That's how you sew French seams on a garment to finish off the seam. And that concludes seam finishes, specifically French seams. I hope you learned a lot and are excited to practice these new seam finishing techniques. I'll see you then.